So the time passed, and the question became who was responsible. As I said, this was a critical issue. There was physical evidence that their guy, Nelson, was the driver. But eyewitness testimony, as I've been saying, is persuasive. And Collander's testimony that he saw Wheeler driving was enough to have him put on trial for murder. At Wheeler's trial, the prosecution's case was based primarily on Collander's testimony that it was Wheeler who was the driver. He said at trial pretty much the same thing that I just read to you. He seemed, as I said, very honest and clearly believes that Wheeler was the driver. He dramatically testified about clearly seeing Wheeler through the truck's windshield from about 10 feet away, just prior to impact. Now, in this case, we have some known physical information. We, of course, have the geography of the scene. The highway intersected with the tracks. We had the speed of the train, 42 miles an hour. It turns out that trains, like airplanes, have black boxes that record their history. We have the speed of the truck, which we could reasonably estimate to be 60 miles an hour. We have the point of impact, which was actually the second car down in the train. And we have Collander's position. He was sitting up here in the very front of this train, looking out. And what we are able to compute from this is, at any given time prior to the accident, the distance between Collander and the truck. What's going to happen here is that as the train's approaching and Collander's down here, the truck and Collander are going to be very far away. They get closer, 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 closer. Here I'm plotting the physical distance as a function of time prior to the accident, where 0 is when the accident takes place. But at some point, Collander is going to cross, Collander himself is going to cross the tracks, and then the distance between him and the truck is going to start increasing again, as I'm showing here. And the bottom line, key important thing, is that the minimum distance was about 70 feet. That was the closest Collander ever was to the truck's driver prior to the accident. So from these calculations and from other considerations, we can conclude that he couldn't possibly have had a clear view of the driver, not a good enough view to distinguish one of these guys from the other. So the question is, why was Collander so sure that he had clearly seen Wheeler's face from 10 feet away? And we can do an analysis based on the kinds of issues that I've been just talking about. Collander's original memory of what happened just prior to the accident was likely very poor because of all kinds of things. And he was also potentially influenced by various types of post-event information, including the fact that while helping Wheeler, Collander never knew that there was a second person in the truck. Right? What's his name was still in the truck, burned to a crisp. So he must have inferred that it was Wheeler, the guy he's tending to, who's the driver. While helping Wheeler, Collander likely reconstructed his memory of what happened just before impact, and as a result, he developed a strong but false memory of an event, clearly seeing Wheeler's face from 10 feet away that he could never have actually experienced. By the way, the 10 feet figure is particularly interesting. Why is that? Well, in looking at Collander's face as he's ministering to him, he clearly develops a strong memory of this guy as the guy he saw through the truck's windshield. Later on, in sort of justifying why he had such a strong memory, what his brain does is basically place the truck at a closer distance than was physically possible. That's another consequence of post-event information. It sort of has ripple effects for logically the way things could have gone down to begin with. So it was based on this strong but false memory that Collander provided all later interview and trial testimony. At trial, Wheeler was found not guilty, but soon after he was sent to jail for committing some other. Okay, one more case, and then I'm going to sort of semi-tell you about one last case. This involved a murder in New Jersey. This is the case that I was engaged in from the outset. It was one that the Innocence Project got involved in, and they contacted me after the fact, after the defendant, who I'm going to tell you about, had already been languishing in jail for quite some time, based on awful identification. I won't regale you, because I don't have time, with all the facts of this case. It was a murder at night. in Newark. And convicted of the murder was a guy named Darrell Edwards. He was convicted on the basis of the testimony of one eyewitness, a woman who wasn't wearing her glasses, who was strongly under the influence of heroin, and who was doing this whole thing at night. This is from the Innocence Project's website from a couple of years ago. The question is, can you recognize someone from hundreds of feet away? And this is what I want to focus on. The Innocence Project client Darrell Edwards was convicted of a New Jersey murder based in part on testimony from a witness who claimed she saw him from 271 feet away on a dark night when she was not wearing her prescription eyeglasses. The website goes on to say, scientifically it is impossible to see someone well enough from that distance and make an accurate identification. Where did they get that it's scientifically impossible? Well, they were relying on an article that I alluded to earlier that my then graduate student Aaron Harley and I wrote about distance, and it was in this article that we provided the theory, the calibration, and the technological wherewithal to create images of people that are blurred to represent loss of information at varying distances. So it's quite intuitive, just to briefly describe what's in this article, that a greater distance diminishes ability to see progressively larger details or features of the face. It's a little less intuitive that this kind of loss of information that corresponds to a given distance is equivalent, literally equivalent, to blurring the face by a suitable amount. It's probably unintuitive that based on reasonable assumptions about how visual information processing works, it's possible to quantify the amount of blur that corresponds to a specific distance. So that's what the Innocence Project asked me to do for them in this case, and that's what I did do. The distance was 271 feet away. Here's what Mr. Edwards looked like from close up. Here's what he looked like from 271 feet away. I'm a scientist. I don't say that anything is impossible, but what the Innocence Project could do was to publish this image on their website and say, even if the witness had had a perfect ability to see the killer apart from distance, even if it had been bright sunlight out, which it wasn't, even if the witness hadn't been under the influence of drugs, which she was, even if the witness had been wearing her glasses, which she wasn't, this would have been the best she could have done in terms of seeing what the killer's face looked like. You tell me whether that would have led to a reliable identification or not. Plus, there was an additional positive evidence, by the way, that Mr. Edwards was innocent, which was how the Innocence Project got into this case to begin with. So let me now just give you some closing thoughts. And I want to do so by, how many people have heard of the case of Jennifer Thompson and Robert Patton? So most of you have. So just very briefly, in July of 1984, in North Carolina, Jennifer Thompson was raped in her college dorm room. Through various ways, a guy named Ronald Cotton became a suspect, and she picked him out of a lineup that was very biased. In 1985, based on Thompson's in-court identification, which followed her selection of him from the lineup, he was convicted of rape and sentenced to life plus 54 years. That's a very long time. You got to stay there for 54 years after you die. Thompson was so certain that Cotton was the rapist that she said, and this is a quote, if he could have gotten the death penalty, I'd have been happy to flip the switch. She was that certain. This was the guy. So from 1984 to 1995, Cotton spent 11 years in prison. On June 30th, 1995, he was exonerated by a VMA that not only ruled him out, but pointed to the actual guy who was the killer, as a rapist, and a guy named Bobby Poole. One of the interesting side issues in this case is that at some point after Jennifer Thompson had identified and had become sure
that Ronald Cotton was the guy who raped her, she was shown Bobby Poole, because he became sort of the suspect through other ways, and she said, no, that's not the guy. It's kind of amazing. She picks out the guy who wasn't the real rapist, she rejects the guy who was, as it turns out, the real rapist. Why is that? Well, it follows from everything I've been saying. Namely that once she identified Mr. Cotton from the lineup, she uses his appearance to reconstruct her memory of what the rapist looked like that she saw on Hancock for the night in her home. So she goes into the viewing room and looks at Bobby Poole, not with a memory that's anything like Bobby Poole's, but with a memory that strongly resembles Ronald Cotton. That's why she fails to recognize the guy who's the actual rapist. From 1995 to the present, a couple of things have happened. Thompson, who's a very moral and ethical woman, was, as you might imagine, horrified that, based on her testimony, the wrong person was convicted. She sought Cotton out and deeply apologized to him. He accepted her apology, and in fact, they wound up writing a book together. This book, Picking Cotton, Our Memory of Injustice and Redemption. So there they are together, Thompson and Ronald